So I'm the chair of this session. My name is Juan Díez Medrano. I'm a professor at the Universidad Carlos III de Madrid. I'm very thankful for the organizers of this workshop to allow me to come here. I've come here mainly as a spectator, even though in my work I deal a lot with issues of European identity. So this workshop was particularly interesting. And anyway, my role here is simply to keep up the times. We have a fairly packed session with three statements. I will ask Hanna, Rocío, and Ulrike to keep to about, I would say, 20 minutes each or less, so that we have time for discussion. So if anything, I'll leave it at 10-15 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. I hope everybody had a good lunch. Well, we've organized the session according to the rules, to the suggestion of the coordinator, because we really thought, okay, after the very interactive session we had before lunch, we can try to wrap up. So I just want to point out two things coming from the paper on identity and diversity. One is the relationship between European and national identities. And if we try to summarize the literature on this, we would like to point to a certain evolution of this theoretical approach, starting from a view that European and national identity can be conflictual or competing with one another for the primary loyalty of people. Research on this topic then moved on to the idea that these are nested identities. So you have the European identity as an umbrella, and underneath it you have the national identities, or you may conceive it a bit as a Russian doll. So it's the different layers of identity. Then further research looked at the entanglement and arguing basically that there are national versions of Europe and European identity in different countries that are emerging. So there can be a Greek vision of what European identity is, and a Polish vision, and the French vision, and so on. And at the same time, as European integration actually becomes more, important, but also more, ingombrante, what we would say in Italian. So it acquires bigger weight and bigger presence. The European elements in each national identity become also more visible. So there is an interaction. The national identity says, okay, in this we are European, or we are important for Europe, we brought this to Europe, and for other things this is less important. And now perhaps, so the question mark here, and it's my contribution to our questions for the workshop and for the CulturalBase project, is, can we say that we're moving now to a new phase where the European identity is an anchor that can be used by regional, national, or minority identities to develop their own narrative and bypass the national? So the European becomes a point of reference for developing the subnational, whether historical minorities, nations without a state, or post-migration minorities. And the second point of my brief intervention now is the motto unity in diversity. So it is basically to emphasize that while it's a very promising slogan, and it's a very open slogan, precisely to signify that European identity is not about a homogeneous cultural content or a very clear set of borders, symbolic, political, ethnic, or linguistic. But it has its self-limitation, because unity can never be perfect, because it's a unity in diversity. So it can never attain the presumption of national unity that is presumed to be more or less homogeneous. And at the same time, diversity is self-restrained, because it can never challenge the unity. So the internal diversity of the European identity can never lead to the breakup of the European identity. And the question that arises is, if we're running here a risk that the subnational identities, this diversity, or even the national identities, are being now reified as if they are clear boxes, containers that make up this unity. And we risk, of course it's not necessary that we do, but we risk of bypassing what you were mentioning this morning, the transformative power of the European and also the transformative power of the interaction between the European and the national and the subnational. So I would like to leave it at that. The idea is that Rocío presents a summary or some main points of the discussions of yesterday afternoon and this morning, and then Ulrike kind of gives a critical comment. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. Thanks, Hanna. Actually, I also wanted to thank Jean-Louis and Nasser, whose paper was also presented as part of our Axis yesterday, and the reflections today, the summary that I've been able to put together here and that I'm trying to have up on the screen. Can anybody help me? Because I actually worked against the clock, you know, and I have them up. So. Okay, so basically the discussion, and it was very complicated. I mean, you can imagine it was very complex. What I've tried to do with the help of Hanna and the help of Alice as well, who did a great job typing everything, it's to capture the main themes, the main topics that came back and that were mentioned several times even. I was very happy to hear that this morning during our session, the stakeholder session, many of the things were repeated again, you know, after yesterday. Okay, so we have it there. There you go. Okay, good. So, but again, I haven't been able to introduce many of the comments that came up this morning, but the idea, and we're not sure about the process yet, but the idea is that when we have this list, that maybe we can get some feedback from you. You know, that based on these discussion topics, that maybe we can have some reaction from you, and you can also help us streamline and fine-tune this set of topics. So, the first one that came up, as we've been seeing this morning, is what is the role of European culture in the construction of an European identity? Considering that identities are constructed on interactions and that it cannot succeed if politically engineered, does European culture constitute a transformative element that can bring in some essential cultural content, such as cultural heritage? We talked a lot about cultural relativism and how it was said that it was the death of European identity. We were talking about how it was a mere bureaucratic identity, something that could be deprived of real content. However, Europeans do look for core values that can be promoted by institutions. There are many powerful elements in popular culture that have not, or that are not usually mentioned, such as, and they were mentioned this morning, such as football, such as Erasmus program, such as Eurovision. So that was the one. And then this morning, actually, Nikos brought in the importance of the perception of the European identity from outside countries, okay? So this idea of Europe as having the potential of building some spaces for cultural intimacy, as he put it. So really how others see us actually also conforms what kind of European identity we are building. The second one, it's a little bit longer, but you know, can we compare national integration and identity building processes with European integration identity building processes, since they have failed everywhere? Instead, actually, what was proposed is that we look at democracy and representation as taking place between the political and cultural realm. People do not feel represented anymore, but at the same time, there's a chance to see where the real change mechanisms are now, and many of them follow a bottom-up dynamic via institutions, civil society organizations, NGOs. These actors are also articulating themselves through organized economic activities to make their production sustainable. So culture could become a paradigm for change with new transnational connections and an emerging role for the social and solidarity economy. In this context, a new type of artists and creators has emerged who are concerned with the transformative power of what they produce. So how could this project, how could this new dynamic that emerges bottom up, how could this be supported from a policy level, and what are the powers that are at work, so the power plays that are at work, and who is behind the construction of European identities? Can we speak of European elites, okay, that are driving the process? The third theme has to do with migration. And we were wondering how does migration into and from Europe affect European identity or identities? So beyond the discrimination based on ethnicity that used to be the case, new types of discrimination appear based on religion and socioeconomic situation. Traditional European citizens are forced into disadvantaged situations, feeling that they no longer have access to rights such as culture. The fourth topic, major, large topic, had to do with the types of identity creation and legitimization dynamics that exist or that no longer exist, actually, and that challenge or question reference frameworks. However, and that was a point that was very well made, whereas some may think about the colonial, the post-colonial luggage or baggage, actually there was this idea of really getting rid of this sense of guilt so as to move forward, recognizing what we said this morning, come to terms with our pasts and find these new dynamics as possibilities, because they are being used that way by some minorities, so as possibilities to articulate new European identities. So it would be interesting to know what are these new dynamics, how can we learn about them and make them more concrete so as to draw new maps through which new claims can be made. Number 5 has to do with the issue of inequality. Okay, so there is an obvious process of social and political inequality, and economic, of course, that is legitimized through various channels. And we were wondering, so what's the process that leads to that inequality, and who benefits from this inequality? There are tensions in the construction of an European identity, and we need to learn and we need to analyze how to deal with these tensions by looking, maybe some ideas, some suggestion that was put forward was by looking at the example of the nation states, how they were built, and how the tensions that were created at the moment were dealt with. Some specific examples from the past can be used to analyze today's immigrant and minority situation. The third one has to do with the symbolic crisis in Europe, which could be considered as the result, among other things, of course, of cultural policies overall in Europe, which have massively failed to achieve the goals that they were set out to achieve. Looking at the paradigms of cultural policy in the last century, we actually see that there's an impact, there's an effect of those cultural policies on European identity. So how do the cultural policy paradigms affect the participation of citizens in culture and thus the construction of European identities? I'm getting towards the end. Number 7, multiple memories are recognized while a central, strong normative discourse is missing. So could European identity serve as a legitimacy device? As we were talking, something is broken, and that was Jean-Louis who noted that. I mean, there's something broken in the reproduction mechanism of legitimization in culture. And there's also an ongoing current de-hierarchization, that's a hard one, hierarchy, so the contrary. But at the same time, we see that communities are forming that actually fulfill that legitimizing role, and that are forming their own identities. So again, we should learn how those identities are forming and how those legitimation mechanisms are taking place. In this context, cultural organizations are undergoing a deep transformation. What is the nature of that transformation in relationship with these new legitimation mechanisms? Number 8, the question of empowerment, which is a very complex one, and that once we move beyond some experiences of window dressing, actually we realize that empowerment is a very complex issue, because power is not something that you can just be, given. It's something that you have to go and embrace yourself. So empowerment also has to do with the de-empowerment of, it's a passing on of powers. So someone actually loses in power. At the same time, technology creates a new space for empowerment. Maybe it's not real empowerment, but in any case, it opens a line of dialogue. And we believe that there are many new circles of empowerment that are created every day through culture, and that are worth following up and studying. Lastly, that's the last point, how can a cultural public sphere be constructed? Culture is also a place for domination and confrontation. So where are the limits of diversity? How will this confrontation evolve in Europe? Actually, the different levels of tension need to be taken into account. We have local decision makers that benefit their constituencies, their local constituencies, national decision makers who benefit their national stakeholders. But what happens with Europe? Who is influencing the decisions that are taking place at the European level? We need to be aware of that void in the cultural sector, because who will be influencing the decisions having to do with culture at the EU level? Will it be corporations? Will it be lobbies? So if we want to defend a diverse culture in Europe, we also must make sure that there's a presence at the EU level, but that it is strongly connected to the local level. That would be it. Again, there are some issues and some things missing, but a lot is there.
Okay. That's a tall task to follow. Yes, I'm not called Ulrike Hanna. I'm called Ulrike Hanna Meinhof. You may have gathered that by now, but this is perhaps a less controversial term to call me just Ulrike Hanna. Yes, what I want to do is basically to address three, to kind of try, I can't possibly summarize it. In any case, it's beautifully summarized up there. So what I will pull out is what I think are three interacting topics that you may want to carry forward and which may form the basis of discussion. Because as Anna started off by talking, and I also, of course, read the other paper that was given yesterday, there's one issue which is really all around the identity discourses, which is saying, how do we actually, what are these processes of identity and identification that appear under different contextual conditions? And that was raised again this morning as well, very interestingly, that we can have, of course, we may have a different form of identity discourses under the context of living across borders and under context of living inside or outside Europe, looking at it from the outside, looking at it from the inside, looking at it under tension from top down, looking at the tension from bottom up. We had a fantastically lively discussion at lunchtime over the issue of Catalonia and Catalonian independence, which is, of course, the very much sort of the risk of the bottom-up risk to a national identity. And then, of course, in Britain, you get this sort of fear of the top-down, how the European identity might swallow up the more regional one. So that seems to be one of the very major topics that are running through there, and how this then interacts with cultural production and issues of culture in general. Now, interlinking to that is the whole question of bordering, and I deliberately say bordering and not borders, because Europe in the last many, many years, ever since the EU got created, it has always moved outwards. And every time it moved outwards, new questions of where the borders are were recreated. And then we created these internal spaces, like with Schengen and so on. So really, for me, one of the key issues is, which is implicit in what was being said, is what happens when borders are removed, i.e. when so-called borders suddenly cease to exist in the inner spaces of Europe, but other forms of bordering occur on the outside of the European spaces, which may be along the national lines or the transnational lines, but also internally, the different kind of ethnic kind of boundaries that are then obviously springing up. We get an increased forms of racism, for example, in Germany, as a result of the disappearance of some of these outside borders. So there is this kind of interlinking between what happens if debordering and rebordering, which is in a dynamic tension with one another. And again, the role of culture is very central to that, because the way these discourses develop is very often around this question of cultural otherness and how we construct that. The linking into this, so these are the sort of two of interlinking questions, if you like, is the kind of bordering and debordering of identity, which then interlinks with the cultural processes. The second important point, which picks up also on one of the papers that was given yesterday and popped up again today in the discussion, really interestingly, is this whole question of inequality, which is, of course, a question of diversity, but the key underlying it got raised in all sorts of different modes and forms. It got raised as a question of why do people come in the first place, and how do we actually assess inequality. But it also came through the paper that I didn't hear delivered but read over the whole Bourdieu notion of cultural capital, and to what extent we now have a different way of thinking about class formation and taste cultures. So there is this, and again, somebody mentioned that today, how does cultural production and class interact with one another? And can we still talk about class, or are we more talking about cultural predispositions and taste cultures, which are, because this morning we were talking about, is a high culture, low culture? This is an ancient debate. I think I entered university with that debate. Is there the whole distinction between so-called high culture and so-called low culture? And of course, this has been long superseded. But on the other hand, certain kinds of cultural production go with different forms of cultural capital. Now, Anna and I, when we were working together, we added a new term, we threw a new term into this debate by not calling it cultural capital, but calling it transcultural capital. And if I may be forgiven to very briefly say something about it, it's really cogent in this debate, because cultural capital has always been the culture of the dominant class. It's a kind of Gramscian concept of the dominant. Whereas transcultural capital, the way we defined it, is the capital that is brought in with migrants as a result of the places where they come from, which is often devalued, but not necessarily. And where cultural production is really important is it's the one area where migrants and immigrants can actually play on their cultural capital. And the way we then developed is to say, well, what are the components of this cultural capital? And one set of things is what the kind of cultural phenomena with which they come. That may be their music, their artistic form, it may be the kind of skills they bring, it may be the languages they speak, which then interlinks with the kind of cultural productions that they find in the new country of residence. However, how does that then translate into economic capital? That's very interesting. The only way it can do this is through their social capital. And the social capital itself is often that which gets discriminated against by being called, oh, these people live in parallel societies, or they remove themselves into their ethnic niches. Well, from the work that I've done, no, they don't. They are moving, they are activating it, they are strategically using it. So I would like to kind of, instead of talking about cultural capital, I would like to replace that by the much more open word of transcultural capital. And that gets me to my last point, which is that in many ways, whenever we talk about cultural things, I would really want to put almost in brackets in front of it transcultural, because when we talk about a cultural public sphere, we are not talking about one homogenic cultural sphere. We are talking about many, many different interacting public spheres, and which include and exclude sometimes the non-European, if you like, in inverted commas. But in many ways, most of the phenomena that we are observing when we are talking about cultural diversity in Europe is really, by definition, transcultural. It's a transcultural space, and if we are thinking about Europe not as a mass of nation states, but if we're thinking of it much more as a transcultural set of processes that are interacting, then I think we may have a more interesting way of debating it. So I have a few, very briefly, some suggestions to make for the next conference, but you may or may not like it. But I was so struck this morning by the way a comment that I made was kind of partly misappropriated, but as if I was just talking about two sets of people. Here were these bunches of, here was this set of cultural actors, and here were these academics, and they both talk completely different languages and tear apart. I didn't mean that at all. What I meant to say was, it's the way our institutionalization works, and as a result of this institutionalization, collaboration is actually quite hard. And we see that if we institutionalize that further by giving one set of papers, which we say these are the academic papers, and then we have the other actors sort of interacting with these papers, we may be already causing some problems from the very beginning. It may be an idea to actually ask. There were some very interesting duos today in the discussion, because Anna, by stimulating that we were not allowed to talk to another academic, but we had to talk to somebody from the other field, some very interesting stuff was being said and exchanged. And perhaps that may be to have, instead of having papers by academic stakeholders, perhaps we could have discussion papers by a duo like this. There were some very fruitful duos I noted in the room, and if they were willing to do that, I think you have already in the next conference, you have already a debate structured into, rather than sort of having to create it on the spot when people come together. So that's my suggestion. Thank you very much.
So I'll moderate the discussion. So if anyone wants to make comments, please.
Thanks. I think that was great. I had two other research questions that I thought came out. And one maybe just a rephrasing of one of them, but it's who identifies with Europe and how is this identification expressed? Whether or how, but who does identify with Europe and how it's expressed? And I guess what are the instruments of inclusion and exclusion in culture, and how can they be influenced? And to me, those are two questions where
I think you have to repeat with the microphone. Yeah.
Two research questions I thought would be useful. One is who identifies with Europe and how is this expressed? How is this identification expressed? And what are the instruments of inclusion and exclusion in culture, and how can they be influenced? And I guess thirdly would be some consideration of the political economy of culture, which I think is important.
I'm becoming more and more concerned about the concept of European values, mainly because I can hear the British Prime Minister talking about British values, which in my list start with hypocrisy, complacency, and denial. And I think you need a higher level. What he claims are British values are tolerance and humane values, and these are human values or humane values, and I think it's the same with Europe. So I think the research question is something like, how are universal human rights and values realized in distinct ways within Europe and through European cultural institutions? And again, I would refer to the human capabilities research of Nussbaum and Zen, rather than the old definition of human rights. They're about human capabilities, human development. Because so someone this morning mentioned good and bad culture. I think there's also a question about the ethics of judging what is good and bad culture. And I think all of the issues about minorities are about, we discussed it in one of our duos this morning, a policy practice duo. The fear of non-European minorities is that they don't subscribe to the core culture that makes European society work. The basic assumptions of opposition in a democracy, even upstream opposition, that they go beyond that, they don't subscribe. So racism is a cultural value. You can pass it on. Huge cultural capital can be derived from racism. But we say that's a bad culture. So you have to have an ethics of cultural judgment as a foundation for any of these conversations, and they have to be more than European.
You please, and then
I'm really interested in your concept of transcultural capital, and immediately when you said it, an example came to my mind, and I thought maybe as a sort of task would be worth tracking such examples. And it's called the Silent University. It sounds like it's familiar to some people, and it's a collective of artists starting in Sweden but then going to the UK and various other places, have used the institutions of art like the Tate and various other museums as a platform in which public engagement can happen by migrants who have skills in their home countries. They could be dentists, they could be plumbers, whatever, but they're not credited for those qualifications in their home, in their place of arrival, and therefore can't practice their actual skills officially. So what the Silent University proposed, and in a very aesthetic way, which was quite beautiful, rather than than as a put down, than as an elevating way, was to create dialogue, first of all, for these people, and an exchange mechanism where they can exchange services, not to do, say, tooth operations, but at least to activate their skills informally and to stimulate a public conversation about recognition, about qualification, about civic participation, and about the transfer of skills and knowledge and cultural knowledge from one place to another. And as this network grew and the locations in which it operated also grew, it created its own transnational network itself. So the Silent University in Stockholm and the Silent University in Eindhoven and the Silent University in London all started to feed each other as they became nodes of a broader system. And I just thought it was a particularly, I was on a judging committee that awarded it a prize, but as you can see, that's why. But had I had the term transcultural capital, I would have used it in my speech. But I thought it might be an interesting opportunity to find examples like this, to track them and see how these concepts are actually operationalized.
let's take the last couple of questions that we'll get answers from our panelists, and then we can gather more questions, please.
The question that I suggest to look into, an interference between European identity and the identity with Western civilization. Whether in our thinking, when we, or not in this room, but usually when people think of European identity or European features, whether to what extent it interferes with Western civilization in general. I have in mind the appeal or the attraction that Europe has for the migrants or for the outside world. It may interfere very much with American things, both on the low or the higher, any level, which I suppose that in their eyes, if you make a test and we read what is written in their sweaters, in their T-shirts, whether it reflects some appeal of the European or just the Western civilization. That is including those things which we consider rather American than European.
So we have a rich set of questions. Who wants to start?
I mean, I don't know how you see it. I mean, I don't see them as much as questions to us, but rather themes to be taken into account when we write the thematic fields, right? So, I mean, I don't have any other reaction other than saying great. I mean, Hanna, Ulrike, do you want to?
No, the same. I liked, I think, all of the ideas. I just wanted to reiterate the thing that our written summary will be on the platform, and I'm sure InterArts will send an email to all registered participants reminding them that the short informal text is on the platform and that they could send us comments. So on top of what we are taking notes now, any other ideas that you may come to your mind, because we do have to decide also 4 topics, and within this theme of identity and inclusion exclusion, European identity and inclusion exclusion, at least 4 topics on which we would like to delve a bit deeper. So any ideas are most welcome.
I just want to really thank you for your comment with the Silent University, which somehow I remember having vaguely heard about it, but I certainly haven't followed it up. And perhaps to make a plea as well that in all these kinds of debates we're having, it's very important we don't lose the sight of the empirical work that's going on, because I mean, I came to transcultural capital not as a result of theorizing Bourdieu, but it was a result of following a bunch of musicians around and trying to work out in a very antagonistic discourse with a colleague why these people were not kind of re-ethnicizing or doing anything really, or what was considered to be very nasty in the set of cosmopolitan discourses we were having, but why there was something incredibly important and valuable going on, which was actually something we could all learn from. And so then we kind of tried to theorize it into something that makes sense, that one can then test against other social groups. And so I'm very grateful to you. But again, as I said, I think these are just very interesting topics and themes that could be worked into the next set of papers for the next session.
Can I ask that we maybe do a little bit more work on the definition?
I'm so sorry. Okay. As a sociologist, I look at identity formation from a positive and from a negative side. So we talked a lot about the positive side now. At least that's my idea of this discussion up until now. I think there are also some ideas about a negative identity. So, okay, let's start from the positive side. If identity strengthening is strengthened by outside enemies, and these can be real enemies or imagined enemies. I've just thought about the crisis in the Ukraine. So is Russia an enemy of Europe? It's just a question I have. On the other side, is TIFF, the American approach to the free neoliberal market, an enemy to Europe? Or is, which then might strengthen European identity in a positive way? Or is the imagined threatening of refugees coming to Europe not also a part of a European identity, which I would not underline and subscribe to, but I think there are a lot of right-wing people who would use that as strengthening a certain type of ideological, exclusive European identity. So the threat from the outside is something that defines identity, and I think that's a question that I think is worthwhile to pursue.
I wonder if
No. No.
I wonder if the questions that we are asking are maybe too general to most root-based stakeholder. I was a couple of weeks ago with a group of European performing arts in the street people, and for these people the important was what is the role of street performing arts in a moment that refugees are arriving to our railway stations. Or I was with a group of people working in libraries, and these people, their problem was how they have to adapt libraries to these inequalities, to these imbalances. And because in general, what the kind of rules they receive, the way to do and to deal with these issues, they feel that they are improvising. But there is not a theoretical framework where they can work with. There is a lot of voluntarism, but not enough. So I think that this idea of European identity is a little bit far away from their interest. Their real interest is we have a responsibility today on what is happening in Europe. We are sensitive people working with intangible, symbolic issues like is art and heritage. So please, researchers, try to help us on building conceptual frameworks and strategic frameworks, not discussing on maybe too theoretical approaches.
Can I say something? I'm just. It's very interesting that you mentioned that, because I had a chance to participate in one of the social platforms. It was Social Polis, so it was social innovation, in urban contexts. And one of the frustrations, and I'm looking specifically at Sultan, when you put in motion a social platform like this one, it's actually you're looking at a research agenda that would cover a span of years in the future. So and precisely because we're working with stakeholders, you're trapped into the urgency of the answers now and the planning for research in the future. And I feel like it's a hard balance to strike, but we need to keep in mind that long term. So it's also our responsibility to identify future trends and things that will be relevant, that may seem a little bit abstract, but that will be relevant for stakeholders and for society, 10 years down the line. That, I don't know if you want to say something.
Okay, I think we are running late, and some of the speakers need to leave, but perhaps just one last one, and then we will stop.
Deva? Yeah. Super quick. And the quick is, I really would like you to consider doing this exercise, as reading that list of points, replacing European identity with people identification in the European project, and see what happens. Because I think some of the issues that are coming up may change of nature.
Is that identification as a singular, or identifications as a plural? Sorry to interrupt.
I'm just repeating what he said. So would that be identification individually?
Replace European identity with people's identifications. So more bottom up and more plural. Okay.
And if I just can say a quick word about this idea of negative identity, I think that is absolutely taken for granted, that identity and identifications aren't always positive. I'm a linguistic ethnographer, and I work bottom up with what people say. And what people say is always a question I mean, half of the time, sometimes you like what they say, but very often you don't like what they say. It is a permanent context of in-grouping and out-grouping, and people contradict themselves within the space of even 90 minutes. I don't even have to do a whole month's field work. I mean, there's a lot of conflictual things that in which we ourselves are placing ourselves vis-a-vis all these many, many insiders and outsiders, which keep on shifting depending on what we have. What we're thinking about. I mean, from my work in the beginning of this century, I was pretty pessimistic about European identity, because when we confronted people with images of 3-generation villages and asked and the towns where they came from, including in the last phase lots and lots of spaces with lots of European symbols on them, people never voluntarily talked about European identity. They always translated it into the regional aid particular thing that was happening on the ground. And so we only could get the people to articulate anything about Europe by asking them specifically that question. I remember in Brussels, our scientific officer being quite depressed about this bit of information when we fed it back to him, that it was not something in the forefront of people's minds. But perhaps it has changed. That is quite a while ago.
Okay. Thanks very much. I guess we
Thank you.
Thank you very much.